Thank you, Anna, and thank you all. It's been a wonderful week for me. It's great to be here. Your hospitality and your generosity to me and everybody that I've traveled with have made it feel like we've been coming home. My name is Brendan Spillane. I'm based in Perth in Western Australia. And my business works in three different spaces. A component of what I do is in the business world. A component of what I do is in the sports world, largely at the high performance level. And a component of what I do is at the school level. So I'm hopeful that as I talk a little bit this afternoon to you about cultural acumen, about reading culture, about understanding the needs of your place and the needs of your people, that what I say will land well in all those three spaces, wherever you're listening from, and hopefully in whatever language and whatever culture you're trying to listen through. This is going to change the slide for me in a moment. I want to be careful that I stand in front of you and I'm clear what the snapshot that I present to you this afternoon actually is. For a start, my working life and my experience in my working life and my experience of leadership in cultures is going to be largely drawn from Australia and New Zealand. I haven't worked extensively in Europe, in the United States. Most of what I've done will be drawn, the stories, the examples, the issues that I raise with you will be drawn from Australia and New Zealand. I hope they're emblematic. I think they're emblematic, and when I read the literature of our times, what I see coming up in the literature around leadership and culture, it sounds like what I'm experiencing in Australia and in New Zealand. I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher, and essentially the reflections of this keynote are really field notes. They're really coming from practice. They're coming from what I've noticed to be the pattern of our times as we gather and work together. You may have gathered already from my accent that I didn't start my life in Australia. I started my life, I was born and reared in Ireland. I hope the translator is getting well paid because it's one thing to express an Australian viewpoint and a New Zealand viewpoint, but to express it with an Irish accent to a Spanish and mixed audience, whoever the translator is, at least double pay would be appropriate for them for this session. And we're shaped by where we've been, all of us, every one of us, every man and woman sitting in the room today. We're a sea of stories. We're shaped by all the experiences, all the people, all the places that we've been. So I spent the first half of my life trying to get warmer, and so far I've spent the second half of my life trying to cool down. So if there's any confusion in what I say to you this afternoon, give me a break. Thank you, Anna. So I'm going to point this at the computer to change the slide. Okay. The work that we do isn't about providing answers. In my business practice, in my sports practice, in my education practice, I have a strong mental model. I have a strong belief, and the colleagues that I work with have a strong belief that once people are clear on their questions, they're pretty clear on what to do next. Experts coming in from the outside with a whole lot of knowledge and a whole lot of framework and a whole lot of thoughts and trying to put that into your context does you a disservice. The best that we can do often is to help places to move beyond questions, beyond answers, and into better questions. I think it was Einstein said once, if I had an hour to solve a problem to save my life, I'd spend the first 55 minutes on the question. Because once I'm clear on the question, the answer shakes out from that. So what we do in organizations, and we'll sit with an organization for 3 years typically. We're not a fly-in, fly-out sort of a business. We will go into an organization and we will stay with them for about 3 years. And in that time, we will walk alongside them and we will try to support their leadership and their thinking. And we will use a whole range of thinking tools, some of the work from the people that have talked this week, to try and make sure that when we leave an organization after 3 years, it's in a better place, it's stronger, that they're not thinking that we were great, but that they're knowing that they are great. The best test of our work is when we leave, is the place better? And do the people feel better? One of the thinking tools we use, for example, a framework that Daniel Kim came up with from systems thinking, familiar to many of you, but Daniel Kim, in broad terms, came up with a framework called levels of perspective and makes the point that you can look at your organization, your classroom, if you're thinking classroom, or your business as an event and watch the events there. You can lift your eyes and look at the patterns of behavior, the systems and structures. You can look higher and think, what are our values? How do we behave? What's our ethical framework and our assumptions? And of course, you can look higher again and say, why do we exist? What's the point of our organization? If we died, if our organization died, how would the world be worse off? And in Kim's framework, the higher up the levels of perspective that you work, the more leverage you have, the more chance you have of changing things so that the changes actually last. You know, it's funny when you introduce yourself to a group of people, you tend to introduce yourself by what you do, sometimes by where you come from. But the truth of all of us is a little bit different to that. And the truth of me is that fundamentally, right here, who am I really? One of the most important things in my life, probably the thing that makes most sense to me, probably the thing that I would die for, are my children. I have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, 25, 22, and 19. When my youngest boy, Ronan, was very little, about 3 years of age, we were a reading family. Remember books? We were a family that read a lot. And at night, like I'm sure many of you as mums and dads, we would always read to our children. And the 2 older ones, Ronan, as a little boy at 3 who couldn't read at all, grew up watching the 2 older ones reading at night to themselves. And always at night, I would sit on his bed with him, and side by side, I'd read him a story or tell him a story. One night, he said to me, as I was about to read my beautiful story, can I read to you? Can I read to you tonight, Dad? Can I read you Harry Potter? Now, I knew that he couldn't read anything. But of course, he said, sure, I'd love that. So I sat back on the pillow, and he sat in beside me, and he opened page 1 of the 227 pages of Harry Potter. And with his eyes, he began to read. Left to right, top to bottom, page to page. I lasted about 3 pages before I started to laugh. And here's what he did then. When I laughed, he put his finger where his eyes were looking. And he said to me, "Did I just read a funny bit?" The things we steal from children. What just happened in the auditorium? We became connected. For a little moment, the barriers between men and women, between cultures and languages, between business people and sports people and educators, between ages, the barriers between us fell away long enough for us to connect our energy. Imagine working in an organization where you could focus that, where you could focus that connected energy, when we could laugh, be joyful, be purposeful and focused, enjoy each other's company, and look back in 20 years' time at this little piece of our life's energy and say, we did a good thing there. That was a good place we created. And we're proud that we were in that business, or in that school, or in that team. I believe that leaders with cultural acumen harness through story, through purpose, through praise, through playfulness. They know how to gather the people. They know how to harness the energy. And more than that, they know how to direct it, orchestrate it, and to focus it on something that will make us proud that we've given this time of our lives to this work. The tragedy, though, is often that most of the time we don't do that. We don't connect as easily as that. Bill Isaacs, who's written is one of the best books that I've read for 20 years in many ways, Dialogue and the Art of Thinking Together. Bill Isaacs talks about the fact that most of the time we think alone. We think in parallel. Now, of course, we think in here alone, but we actually don't even talk well. We don't talk well about our thinking. You know, what I'm saying right now is not what you're hearing. When I say a word like leadership, you'll hear leadership in your terms. Somebody uncharitably once described an organization as a stupid group of smart people. And there's some truth in that. Because for too much of the time, in the organizations that we work and lead in, for too much of the time, we don't come together well, we don't connect our energy well, and our talk lets our thinking down. I want to share a puzzle of practice with you. The puzzle of practice is just because when you're in an organization, you're working with them for 3 years, every now and again, you become intrigued by something that's happening that you can't explain. All these smart people do something really dumb. You go to a meeting and you realize nothing actually met. The people talked like children in a kindergarten in parallel to each other. So a puzzle of practice is something, if I could get my organization to talk about something, if I could eavesdrop on a conversation that my organization needed to have, what would I love them to talk about? What would I love my organization? What's our real question at the moment? And everyone in the room here, everyone in the auditorium here, I'm sure will have puzzles of practice, things that puzzle you about the place you're in right now. Have a quick moment with the person next to you. What is a puzzle of practice for you at the moment? What is there something that's happening in your organization that's just not right? And that you'd love to have a conversation around and to figure out. Just a quick moment or two for you to think about and talk to one other person next to you. What's a current puzzle of practice for you? And I'll call you back in 2 minutes. Okay. Thank you. Here's one of mine. Here's something that really puzzles me. Usually when we work in an organization, we'll end up coaching some of the leaders. So you might be coaching, the CEO of a company, or you might be coaching a coach of a football team, or a principal or an assistant principal of a school. And you'll work very closely with that person. And in your coaching, you'll get a sense of what that person intends for their leadership. People will tell you, I want to be this kind of a leader. I want to be a leader that really believes in other people. I want to be a leader that really energizes the place. And you'll think, wow, fantastic, what a good person. This is a deep, good intent for their leadership this person has. And we also get the opportunity to interview their people, to interview the people that they lead. And there's often a huge gap between what they want and what people experience from them. I mean, they say this lovely thing about the place and their leadership. And this other thing often turns up. I mean, you meet it in all sorts of guises. You meet the person who says, come to me at any time. I'm always available to you, my people. I can't understand it. Nobody comes through the door. And when you talk to the people, you hear, we're all afraid of him. She's very formidable. She frightens the bejesus out of us, as they say in Ireland. Some parts, Carol. You also see it, here's another intention. I don't want to be center stage. I'm, quiet, unassuming person. It's not about me. But I notice how even my feathers are looking at me. Somebody else says something funny. That delay is quite, is quite interesting. What about this person? After a crucial meeting, and you've had to have a performance review, or you've had to say something difficult to someone, and you wander out, I thought that went quite well. She's around the corner crying with all her colleagues because she's been devastated by what you've said. So the intention of the leader is not always the impact that the leader actually has in the place. And it puzzles me, and I want to work through this puzzle a little bit because I don't know why it should be that way, and I don't think it has to be that way. Most leaders will say things like, I want a team of leaders here. Team of leaders, that's what I want. Everybody flourishing, beautiful space for us all. But the language changes often long before the behaviors. And there's a tragic sort of trappedness. Rather than oak trees, at times, we remain trapped as acorns. You go into the place and you see a small version of what it could be. You talk to the people and you see like bonsai people. They kind of look like they're full shape from a distance and maybe in a certain light, but they're smaller versions of the professional people that they could be. Places trapped in tragedy of potential, places trapped in tragedies of mistrust at times, and places trapped in that horrible gap between what we intend and what we transact. You could ask another question to come on and say, well, maybe this puzzle of practice is really just the times we live in. You know, we live in crazy times. Crazy times. I think the scale of change is unprecedented. It feels that way. And maybe that's what's causing us to be so far away from what we hope for as we exercise our leadership. How are the times for you? I naively, 25 years ago, I'm like the rest of you, I guess, I love technology, but naively about 25 years ago, I thought I was going to be on holidays by now, that technology was going to free me up to have this beautifully creative, existence. And it hasn't turned out like that for me at all. I'm busier now than I ever was. So perhaps the speed of the times is causing our issues. There is lots of commentary on this. I'm not sure if you've read Nicholas Carr's book, The Shallows. Books, remember? Dangerous Things. On the last page of Nicholas Carr's work, he quotes from Heidegger. I'm not going to read the slide out for you. Somebody once told me that if your slide is saying the same thing as you are, one of you is superfluous. But there is commentary that says the people are struggling, and that speed is an issue for us. There is some dystopian commentary. I mean, Piero Ferrucci, who's a transpersonal psychologist, he talks about global cooling. You know, we talk global warming in Australia and New Zealand. Again, I'm presuming it's a big conversation in Spain and in England and everywhere else. He talks about global cooling. And when he talks about that, he talks about an ice age of the human heart, that we are about the long horizon, our digital space, and we're in here very busy, and that the casualties of those two spaces is the space between us, the sort of space where we meet as human beings, where we gather as human beings. I don't think it's as bad as he feels, but it seems, you know, there is plenty of informed and good commentary that says we are facing some challenges in remembering how to see each other as human beings. The technology writer Sherry Turkle, in her book Alone Together, puts it like this. I mean, I experienced it this morning. I went for a walk this morning down by the river, and take the cafe out of this quote. At a riverbank, a block from my hotel, everybody going past me was on their iPhones, on their iPods. Those people were not my friends, and yet I somehow missed their presence. I was brought up in the time when it was really difficult for me not to acknowledge somebody coming towards me. I thought I was lucky this morning. Every morning that people have just avoided me, like I was maybe potentially a serial killer. So the people walk past you, including a lot of people that I know from the conference here, so locked into their own space. This morning I thought I was getting lucky because there was a guy coming towards me, older guy, older than me, which is quite old, and he took his headphones out as I was approaching him. And I thought, oh, here we go, somebody. And I thought maybe somebody from the conference is going to say hello. But no, he took his headphone out and he swore at it. He was Spanish, and he swore viscerally. He swore well. I couldn't tell what he was saying. It was just a lot for an Irish person to say, some Irish people, because for the Irish, swearing is not offensive. Swearing for the Irish is punctuation, right? It's just nothing meant by it except to give us time to think. But Sherry Turkle, right, though technology is her thing, somehow I miss their presence. We miss each other. She does go on to say, though, and it's a good thing in a sense, she says it's just that we haven't figured out what the next is. You know, we're having to reconsider what it is to be human. The demands of a digital lifestyle, the speed of the life that we're living, is asking us some questions about what does it mean to be human. And we haven't quite figured out who are we now in this new space that we've created. You know, how augmented do we want to be with technology? How different do we want to be? What are the prices that we will pay for that? Are we prepared to pay those prices? And I think that's probably where I sit. The Global Leadership Mindful Conference last year, just so that you don't, I would be really, really hate you to think that this is let's stop the times conversation. It's not. The people who came to this conference were Google, Stanford University, the World Economic Forum. And the flyer for the conference said, we need to reimagine how we're working. The ways we're working with each other are not working. More and more people are finding it really too difficult to stay up with the pace of the life that we're setting up for them. And I think that's probably where I sit. It's certainly where I felt last year. I mean, here we go. First of all, the boundaries between work and home sort of fell away. And work comes home with you in your pocket. Work actually gets home before you. So the idea that you went home from work, the idea that you go home from work is a quaint notion. You don't go home from work anymore. You go home with work in your pocket, on your iPad, and so on. But a good thing has started to happen, because that has some dangers. A good thing has started to happen. I believe that life has started to follow us into work. That people want to have a different conversation about what it means to be professional. That people want to have a different conversation about joy, about working together, about whether what we're doing is good for the world. I believe that when work came home with us, we handled that a little bit. I think we're now finding that home is coming to work with us. And in leadership terms, I see it everywhere. That in book after book, in blog after blog, on website after website, I see an increased interest in wisdom and in talking about love and compassion and joy and friendship, and not leaving that talk outside the workplace, having that talk inside the workplace. I'm not sure, again, how anybody else has experienced this. Have you noticed that the people are asking different questions? Have you noticed when you interview somebody nowadays, they're interviewing you too? Like when I was a young workforce person, when I went for a job interview, I basically was trying to work out how many lies do I have to tell you so that you think I'm the right person for the job. When you're interviewing Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen Now, they're also interviewing you to see, is this a good place for me to be? Is this a good place for me to put my life energy? Is this a good place for me to work? I think that's a good thing. Just again, quick buzz between yourselves. Have you noticed in the literature, in whatever space you're coming from, I see it in Dan Pink's work, I see it in Brené Brown's work, I see it everywhere. I see it everywhere. I see an increasing interest in wisdom, in cultural acumen, the things that make us human turning up in our workplace and in our work reading. Just again, a quick perception check. Are you noticing the same thing? If nobody speaks, I'll realize that I'm just reading the books that nobody else is reading. So a quick buzz. Okay. Let's push on. Just to honor the time, the finishing time at 4:30, I'd like to have left you in that space for a little while longer. Lots of people are getting this right. Just last week, 2 weeks ago, I worked with three leaders in three different disciplines, and each one of them, when I asked their people about them, each one of them said, a transformative person, a figure of hope, a joyful person to work with, a person who's getting the team of leaders that the place needs. It was amazing. Three people, one an entrepreneur, one the leader of a high-performance environment, and another a person at a lower level in an organization who was just known as a leader. I was doing a workshop on influence, and I had to talk about influence and what influence meant and the science of persuasion, essentially. And I asked the business to say, can you tell me who's your most influential person? In your business, who's your most influential person? And most people gave me the same name. They said, this person is really influential. He was a man. I said, would he come along and spend an hour with us in the workshop and talk about how he does his work? And give us a sense of how he influences, how he leads. And yeah, they said, we'll ask him. And he generously came along and he spent an hour talking to his peers, talking to his colleagues about how he saw his work. And the very first thing he said silenced us all because it wasn't what we were expecting. This guy is hard, tough, great negotiator, tough guy. And the first thing he said was, my mantra is that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. Be kind always. It's such a powerful thing to say. Everyone is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. Be kind. He had to do hard things, but he had a deep kindness and a deep compassion for the people that he had to do those hard things with. And they knew it, and they saw it. And I think we can learn a lot from people who are getting leadership right in 2015. Take our eyes off people who are getting it wrong and study the positive deviants, the ones who are getting it right. When you do, you see a number of things. As I got to know him, there was a spaciousness about him. He didn't seem to feel too identified with his performance. He wasn't so close to it that he felt every time something went wrong, he was wrong. He had a spaciousness, a sense almost that nothing is personal unless you choose to make it personal. He had a humility. He had a deep humility. Though respected, he had a deep sense that he knew a little bit. I'm indebted to Marlies Whitty, actually, for this metaphor. She explained humility and ignorance, basically. She said, if what you know about your work is the size of a golf ball, right? So inside the golf ball is everything you know about your discipline. Your contact area with your ignorance is that size. The surface of the golf ball is your contact area with what you don't know. And as your learning and your knowledge grows, technical knowledge, your work knowledge, and you get to be the size of a basketball in terms of what you know, look what comes along with it. A much, much greater understanding or surface area, contact area with what you don't know. It's almost always the case that people who are brilliant at what they do, that they have humility because they're really conscious of what they can't do and that they need the genius of the group. When less is personal, there is less to defend. So looking at these three people, two men and a woman that I worked with, as I was thinking about ICOT, and I was thinking, how did these guys get it right in these times? There was less personal for them. They went home and relaxed. They played their sports. They didn't stay the longest every day. They stayed long days when they needed to, and they went home early when they could. Everybody knew they had lives. Everybody knew they had wives and children and husbands and friends and passions outside of work. They weren't martyrs. Martyrdom is bad for succession planning. If all people see from your leadership is you being crucified every day, don't be surprised when you say, anybody like a promotion? If not too many hands go up. Isaacs again says, 4 things happen when we're non-defended. 4 things happen when the leader gives permission to a place through not being defended in their power. And the 4 things he talks about are simple things in some ways. He says, we start to listen. We start to listen to each other. We start to suspend our mental positions. We start to voice what we really think. And we start to respect each other. When the energy in a place is non-defended energy, as best we can possibly make it, a different set of things start to happen. Look at them in the anatomy of those 4 things. There's listening. Stance is inquiry. We're not trying to fix. And I'm going to stop reading now in case I read the whole slide and make myself superfluous. There's listening. There's suspending. I am not my mental positions. It's just what I think. If somebody wants to disagree with me, I can hold my position out here and listen to what they have to say. There's voicing. I trust myself, and when something needs to be said to the campfire, to the shared space of our organization, I say what I think. Nobody has to guess what I'm thinking. And there's respecting. Respecting comes from the Latin to take a second look. Respecere. Look again. Don't imagine someone in your head. Look at who you're with. Give them a second look. And places that treat each other with that, treat each other with respect. In sort of broad terms, you know, when I was a child on the beach in Ireland, it probably happened once, knowing the weather there, but when you're a child on the beach, on a windy day, and you're playing with the sand, and you think, I wonder how much sand can I hold in my hand? And you take a big handful of sand, and you grab it really tightly. And lots of it gets away. You end up with something that the wind can't blow away. Not very much, and a cramp in your arm from holding on. Another way, how much sand can I hold in my hand, is to take a big handful of sand and let the wind blow some of it away. And unless it's a very, very stormy day, you're still going to end up with much more sand in an open hand than you will in a closed hand. And in many ways, that's a metaphor for this kind of leadership I'm trying to talk about. Leadership that allows, that's capacious, that's spacious, that allows people to let you down. You'll always end up more than the leadership that tries to command and control and define and bound and make sure that everybody does what they're told. I don't know what your leadership's like. I don't know if you could describe yourself. And to be honest, because intention is not impact, would the others who aren't here describe you as a leader with an open hand? Would they describe you as a leader with a closed hand? Would they describe you as both, depending on the circumstance? My belief is that the default position should be open. There's a time for that, and there's a time for this. And more often, this works better nowadays than that. Some people worry that leading like that, openly, is really only following, because the people will run rings around you. It's not what I see, especially if it's connected to narrative intelligence, especially if the leader with the open hand has a narrative intelligence, has a capacity to tell the story of the place well. I want to look just for a few moments on narrative intelligence. My eldest son is an engineer, and when he was trained, he brought back his training materials to me. And in his training materials, they talked about the intelligences that you needed to have as a leader. And they had technical intelligence, emotional intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, social intelligence, and they had this other thing called NQ. And I said, what's that, Kieran? And he said, that's narrative intelligence. That it's good to have the other intelligences, they're critical, but the ability to tell the story of the place well, the ability to have the cultural acumen to read the times well, that's a special intelligence. And I think special in our times more than ever before. Because I think we're interregnum. You know that term, have you seen the term interregnum? It means between two things. In England from 1649 to 1660, when Charles I was gone and there was no king until 1660, and Oliver Cromwell ran the country, they were between thrones, between kings. And I think in our culture, certainly in the Western culture, the old has died. There's a lot that's passed away for us. There's lots of old things and thinking that's gone now for us. But I don't quite think we know the new yet. I think we're surfing it. I think we're experiencing it. I think at the very front edge, some people get it. But I think most of us are interregnum, between two things. And interregnum is uncertain. And people who can tell stories of hope, stories of coherence, stories that make sense, are really powerful people when the times are shifting, when the tectonic plates that we've taken for granted start to move apart. Here are the two capacities that a narrative leader seems to have. They can do that. They can get above the times and they can look at the pattern of the thing. But they can do more than that. They can come back and they can tell the story and look after the people well. Narrative intelligence can see the pattern of our times, but they can also see the people, and they can help the people to understand the pattern. It's a very profound thing when you see it happening. It connects with what Jeff said this morning on stance. My understanding of stance is that here's the person, here's their performance, like two sides of a river. Imagine a bridge between them. A person with narrative intelligence is not stuck talking performance all the time, and they're not stuck talking personal, pastoral all the time. They can move where the situation needs them on the bridge. They can take a stance close to the person if they need to, but they can also take a stance and have a hard conversation about performance if they need to. Stance is timing. Stance is where you decide you need to be in a given situation. You see bridges like external and internal. I can look at the outside, I can look at the inside. You see stance like the person and the performance. You see stances, people taking stances like, when should I ask the people I lead? When should I ask them instead of when should I tell them? We see stance turning up all over the place, longer term and shorter term thinking. The ability to pick your stance right is cultural acumen too. Where do I need to be in this moment to get what the organization really needs and wants and desires? Can I take my stance? Worked with a rugby team that went to a world championship. The leader was all performance, the coach. His assistant coach was all person, pastoral, looking after the people. And the leader couldn't go to the tournament, so he sent the assistant coach to the tournament. Because the assistant coach's stance was always for the person, the leader and himself fell out. Because he wanted him to be here, the assistant coach felt, I can't be here. We're away from home. I need to be here. And so I watch people taking their stance all the time in their leadership lives. So what starts to happen on the ground of places when we get this right? 2 minutes to go. We'll whiz through a couple of things. I see three things at least. When stance is right, when leaders are able to read the times and read the people and bring the story together well, when they can listen and suspend and voice and respect and honor the people well, I see great benefits. I see innovation benefits, I see clarity benefits, and I see engagement benefits. You know, innovation, what sense can you make of a question? Would you even ask a question like this if you didn't feel safe, if you didn't feel listened to, if you didn't feel voiced honestly with, if you didn't feel respected? How could you ask an innovative question like, where in our organization are we forest and mature? And where in our organization are we acorn? Where are our possibilities for the next place? Roland Smith, when he wrote the book Reality Test, just last year, I think, how would that question make sense until a place is safe? How can you ask a big question like that? Would our organization go to heaven if we needed to die now? Patrick Lencioni, who asks clarity questions about organizations, they're his 6 clarity questions. Why do we exist? How do we behave with each other? What is our work? When are we successful? What's most important right now? Who needs to be doing what? And he says that if any of us can't answer those 6 reasonably coherently, the organization isn't clear. To get there, you have to have the cultural acumen to allow the people to speak. It's a disaster to lose sight of the stars. That's what the word disaster means. It's a nautical term originally, maritime term. Aster is stars. This is separate. And when sailors couldn't see the stars, when they became separate from the stars, that's when the ship would founder. when an organization can't see its purpose, when an organization can't see its values, when an organization can't see its truth, the organization runs the risk of foundering too. When you have clarity, you can ask this question. We asked it in a big company. I worked with Bill Martin and John Edwards and Mary Wilson, and we asked them on our first day, as we were trying to get a sense of their truth, if you were bringing somebody on a tour of this place, where would you not want them to see? You know, what should we stop doing around here? Before we talk about all the stuff we could do, what should we stop doing? This was a group of systems technicians, very technical people. And they went off and they voted, and when they actually compiled their data and took their answer, what they said that the first thing that they would stop doing is that they said, we need to stop gossiping about each other, because we're harming each other by talking about each other when we're not around. The answer they expected, but because they're clear and courageous, and because they had the kind of leadership that allows them to speak honestly, they were able to name something that was really, really important for them to work on. I think we sometimes forget that we're human beings. Like, we're not human doings. Last I checked, we're still human beings. We're not the mahout. That's the little guy that sits on top of the elephant. We're the mahout and the elephant. Our organizations are emotional places. The noises in my head bothering anybody else? In terms of engagement, you start to move away from the leadership. When you get this sort of non-defended energy in your leadership, you have a chance of constructing a team of leaders. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts, one from the new CEO of Google Australia. She says the best piece of advice she was ever given, long before she became the head of Google Australia, was lead always as if you were leading an army of volunteers. Treat the people as if they all didn't need to be there. There's power, there's condensed power, truth in that for our times. Our times require the genius of the group. Complex problems that we're all facing require the genius of the group. They can't be solved by a leader sitting on a throne. The Napoleonic view of leadership is gone. We do better together. And it's a hell of a lot more fun. And I think what we'd say is, be that kind of leader. Be that kind of leader. Lead that kind of a place. Because the world needs it more now than ever before. I wish you well. Thank you very much for listening.